Chapter 1. The New Teacher. My name is Seema. My friends call me Seema. I'm 16 years old and I live near Boston. My town is beautiful and very green. I live here with my parents and my dog Fred. I go to school at Jefferson High and I want to become a journalist. In my free time, I play volleyball and I listen to heavy metal music. I want to tell you my story. It was the first day of high school. I was excited. I already knew most of my classmates, but I didn't know my new teachers. I got up, ate my breakfast, and went to school. On the street, I met my friend, Sona. Her house is near mine, and we always walk to school together. I hope our new teachers are men. And I hope they're handsome, Sona said. Sona loves talking about boys. Yes, I need something new and interesting in my life, I answered. We arrived at school and went into our classroom. A young man was inside. Hello, boys and girls. I'm your new science teacher. My name is Mr. Hans. I hope to work well with you this year. Sona and I looked at Mr. Hans. He was tall and thin. He had blonde hair and brown eyes. He seemed friendly. We're lucky. I think he's a very handsome teacher, Sona said to me. Yes, he is, I answered. I looked at him and he looked at me. Our eyes met. What's your name? He asked, smiling. Seema? I answered. I was a little nervous. He turned to Sona. And who are you? I'm Sona. Sona gave him a big, enthusiastic smile. At that moment, the noise of an airplane attracted our attention. Everyone in the class looked out of the window, but the sun was in front of us. It bothered our eyes. We turned away from the window. Except Mr. Hans. He was at the window and was looking directly at the sun. The sun didn't irritate his eyes. Gee, I thought, how can he look at it like that? The airplane then passed and the lesson continued. When the hour finished, another man walked in. This one had black hair and green eyes. His nose was small and pointed, and he had strangely high cheekbones. What a weird-looking teacher, I said to Sona. Wow, you're right, she exclaimed. The teacher didn't smile and spoke coldly to the class. I'm your English teacher. I want you to be on your best behavior this year. The lesson can begin. And remember, no talking. Everyone in class was evidently shocked, but no one said anything. Another student, Steve, raised his hand. What? Asked the new teacher in his cold voice. Excuse me, but what's your name, Mr. John? He answered. I then noticed that his voice wasn't just cold. It was metallic and monotonous. Sona looked at me with disappointment. She raised her eyebrows. What's his problem? She mouthed. The lesson proceeded. Mr. John read a poem from our English literature book. His voice was weird. Very weird. It had no emotion. It was almost robotic. Someone touched me. It was Sona. Isn't he horrible? She whispered. I nodded. The other teachers we met that morning were Miss Smith, the arts teacher, and Mrs. Ching, who taught math. Both seemed nice. Miss Smith, in particular, was a very cheerful person. I always eat lunch at school. That day, I ate with Sona and Paul Miller, another friend from my class. Paul was a very intelligent boy. He was always the best in math. His parents were divorced, and he lived with his father and his black cat, Apollo. He missed his mother. She lived with another man and didn't want to see Paul. His father was never at home, so Paul was very lonely. He didn't have many friends at school because he was too intellectual. He loved Apollo very much and spent a lot of time with him. "What do you think about our new teachers?" I asked my friends. "I think Mr. Hans is very sexy," said Sona. "Did you see how he looked at the airplane? The sun didn't bother him." "Didn't bother," exclaimed Paul. "You're right," I said. "But did you hear Mr. John? He speaks like a robot. His voice is cold and metallic." "He's unfriendly too," added Sona. "That's true," I said. "Look," said Paul. "Look what he's eating." We looked at Mr. John. He sat away from the other teachers, and he didn't have a normal lunch. There was a glass in front of him. It was full of a dense green liquid. There were some black pills in his hand. He put 2 of them in the glass. The green liquid started to bubble, and it changed color. It started to become red. Then he took the glass and drank the mysterious red formula. I looked at Paul, and he looked at me. We were disgusted and frightened. Sona tried to be rational. "Maybe it's a new diet. Maybe that's why he's so thin," she said. I didn't agree. There was something strange about Mr. John. That afternoon and the next day, we met our other new teachers. We also had English again. Mr. John came in and sat down. "Miller, Paul Miller, tell me something about yourself." Paul was surprised. English teachers don't usually ask personal questions. "Well, Paul, don't you have anything to say?" Well, I enjoy astronomy. I have a cat." Mr. John asked everyone to say something about their life and hobbies. Maybe he wants to create a relationship with us, but he's such a cold person. How bizarre, I thought. Then, looking at him more carefully, I noticed something. His eyes weren't green anymore. They seemed a darker, different color. I raised my hand. "May I go to the bathroom?" I asked. As I walked towards the door, I looked at Mr. Stone's eyes again. I was right. They were yellowish-brown. They looked like amber. That afternoon, I sat on my bed and thought about my first 2 days of high school. I wanted to know more about Mr. Jan. I decided to go and visit Paul. Paul was in front of his computer. He was very interested in astronomy, the occult, and life on other planets. "Hi, Paul. What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm on the internet. I'm in contact with the International Space Fan Club. Listen to this. Something very important is happening. A comet is passing through the Virgo constellation. There are the right connections for intergalactic meetings. The Earth has been in the Virgo constellation since last week." "But what are intergalactic meetings?" I asked. "They're voyages of aliens to our planet. These voyages can happen only in special moments. For example, when a constellation and a comet meet. Aliens can travel to our planet for different reasons. Sometimes they want to study us humans. Some people say that aliens may come to Earth to conquer the planet. I looked at Paul with a shocked expression. An idea started to form in my mind. "What's wrong, Jenny?" Paul asked. "Maybe Mr. Jan is an alien," I exclaimed. "Jay, aren't you exaggerating? Come on, get real." "Well, his voice doesn't seem human. His eyes change color. And do you remember the green liquid and the black pills he had for lunch?" "What do you mean his eyes change color?" Paul asked. "Didn't you notice? Yesterday they were green. Today they're amber-colored," I answered. "Even if his eyes change color, I still don't believe he's an alien." But the comet explains everything. It entered the Virgo constellation last week, and Mr. Khan is a new teacher. I talked to Sona's brother, Matt. He said that this is Mr. John's first year at Jefferson High. "No one knows where he comes from," I said. "Maybe." Paul's eyes lit up. Maybe that's why he asked us all those personal questions. He wants to study us. Yes. You see, all clues indicate that he is an alien. "So, what can we do?" I asked. "We can spy on him. Maybe we can follow him to his house. We can see where he lives and what he does at home. However, we must be very careful. He doesn't seem to have emotions. He might get angry if he discovers we suspect him. We'll try to follow him tomorrow, after school, okay?" said Paul. The next morning before school, I took Fred out for a walk in the park. Fred needs daily exercise, so my parents and I take turns walking the dog. The park was empty. It was dawn. A lonely bird chirped in the trees. The grass was wet with dew. There was peace all around. Suddenly, I noticed something, or someone, moving behind the bushes. I got closer to see who or what it was. In the clearing, there was a man. He was looking up and his arms were raised. He bent down and touched the ground. Then he stood straight again, face and hands again directed to the sky. After about a minute, he turned around. It was Mr. Jan. Was he communicating with the universe? With his planet? Was he really an alien? I quickly walked away. Fortunately, Fred didn't bark. I took my dog home and then met Donna. We walked to school. I wanted to tell her about Mr. John, but I didn't. It was too difficult. Besides, I couldn't tell her about the afternoon plan because it was too dangerous for 3 people to follow the teacher. During the morning, I thought about Mr. John again and again. I was scared, but also excited. I took my dog home and then met Sona. We walked to school. I wanted to tell her about Mr. Jan, but I didn't. When the science class started, Mr. Hans walked in. "Come on, boys and girls. Today we're going to the science laboratory," he announced. "In our lab, there are some white mice and some hamsters in cages." As Mr. Hans passed by their cages, they started to squeal loudly. They were very agitated. Mr. Hans laughed. "What's wrong?" he said, speaking to the animals. "I won't eat you." Then he gave us some worms. You must cut them into little pieces. The pieces can live and move independently, he said. I looked at my worm. It was pale and slimy. I didn't want to cut it up. Seima, are you afraid of cutting up your worm? I looked up. Mr. Hans was at my desk. He smiled down at me. Give me your knife. I thanked him and gave it to him. His arm touched mine. It tickled. An electric shock ran through me and I jumped. What's wrong? Asked Mr. Hans. He seemed frightened. Nothing, I answered, trying to smile. He helped me cut up my worm, then walked away. No one else in class had noticed anything. I didn't know what to think. Were all my teachers weird, or was I just too imaginative? I wrote a note to Paul and told him what had happened. Paul, I whispered. Paul turned and looked at me. I passed the note. Excuse me, what are you doing? Paul, what do you have in your hand? Asked Mr. Hans. His voice made me freeze. We were in very big trouble. Nothing, said Paul. Please listen to the lesson. If I see you again, you must give me the note. I'm sorry, answered Paul. Woo! I was so happy that I wanted to laugh. Obviously, I didn't. When the bell rang, Mr. Hans called me to his desk. Oh no, I thought. He smiled. I'm sorry I scared you. 2 years ago, I had an accident. My left arm is artificial. It's an electric prosthesis, and sometimes it can give electric shocks. He seemed a little embarrassed. I was surprised and sorry. He was so sweet. I thanked him and went to lunch. Paul, forget what I wrote, I said as I sat down at our usual lunch table. I told Paul and Sona about Mr. Hans's electric prosthesis. Then Sona mentioned Mr. John. Paul and I looked at each other, but we didn't say anything. Besides, after school, Sona had a dance club meeting in the gym, so Paul and I were free. We finished our chocolate milk and went out to recess. At the door, we met Mr. John. His head was down. He seemed deep in thought. Hi, Sona said to him. Oh. Hi, he said, surprised, lifting his head. His eyes were green again. Wow, that Mr. John is really a mystery, Sona exclaimed. I still didn't want to tell Sona the whole story, so I changed the subject. Fortunately, the bell interrupted us. Before entering class at 1 o'clock, I took Paul aside. I quickly told him about what I had seen in the park. Wow, I wonder what we'll see this afternoon.